The whistle of the locomotive was a mournful cry that seemed to echo the hollowness in Elara Vance's stomach. She stepped down from the carriage onto the splintered platform of Harmony Creek, Montana, clutching the handle of her worn suitcase. The journey had stripped the last of her meager savings, but it was meant to be an investment in a future secured by a promise. A promise made in neat, confident handwriting on stationery that smelled faintly of expensive cigars. Mr. Jedidiah Croft, the proprietor of Croft's Mercantile, had written of a prosperous town, a comfortable home, and the need for a good wife to share it with. The sun beat down with an indifferent intensity, baking the dust that coated everything, including the hopeful black fabric of Elara's only good dress. She stood where she was told she'd be met, a lone, quiet figure by the water tower. Men in wide-brimmed hats and women with weary faces bustled past, their glances brief and dismissive. An hour bled into 2. The initial knot of nervous anticipation in her chest tightened into the cold stone of dread. Finally, a man matching the proud photograph Mr. Croft had sent, stout, with a florid face and a suit too fine for the dusty street, strode out of the Mercantile across the way. He wasn't looking for her. He was marching toward her, his expression a thundercloud of displeasure. He stopped a few feet away, looking her up and down not as a prospective bride, but as a piece of livestock that had failed to meet the auctioneer's description. "You are the Vance woman," he boomed, his voice carrying across the platform. Elara's own voice was a fragile whisper. "I am, Elara Vance. It is a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Croft." She managed a small, hopeful curtsy. He scoffed, a wet, ugly sound. "Pleasure. Madam, you have wasted my time and your own. The photograph you sent must have been 10 years old and taken in the kindest of light." He gestured dismissively at her tired face and simple dress. "I am a man of standing in this town. I require a wife who reflects that station. You reflect nothing but a long and arduous journey. The arrangement is cancelled." The words were like slaps to the face. Public, brutal, humiliating. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered, their faces a mixture of pity and cruel curiosity. Elara felt the blood drain from her face, her carefully constructed composure crumbling into dust. "Put your letters," she stammered, holding up the packet of his promises as if they were a shield. "You wrote to—" "I wrote to the woman in the photograph, not this waif," he sneered. "You are not my concern." With a final, contemptuous look, he turned on his heel and marched back to his store, leaving her standing in the ruin of her hopes. The world swam. The whispers of the townsfolk were a buzz of unseen insects. She had nowhere to go, no money for a ticket back to a home that no longer existed. She sank onto the hard station bench, her body finally surrendering to the despair she had held at bay for 1,000 miles. The suitcase slipped from her grasp, and Elara Vance, the abandoned mail order bride, finally wept. Her sobs were quiet, defeated things, meant for no one. Across the street, leaning against a support post of the livery stable, Silas Blackwood watched the entire sordid affair. He had come to town for supplies, a task he undertook with the grim efficiency of a man going through motions. For a year, since he had buried his beloved Lydia, his life had been nothing but motions. His heart, he thought, was as fallow as the fields he'd neglected. He watched Croft, a man he already disliked for his arrogance, dismantle the young woman's dignity with the casual cruelty of a boy kicking over an anthill. And then he watched her collapse onto the bench, her small shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it seemed to reach across the dusty expanse and touch the frozen core of his own. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a year, a hot, protective anger. It was an injustice, plain and simple. He pushed himself off the post, his long legs carrying him across the street with a purpose that surprised even him. He wasn't a man who interfered, but Lydia had always said his heart was too good to stay hidden forever. He stopped before the weeping woman, his large frame casting a shadow over her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone, rough from disuse. Elara flinched, looking up through a blur of tears. She saw a tall, formidable figure, a man with shoulders broad as an axe handle and a face etched with its own deep, quiet sorrow. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, held no pity, but a kind of solemn understanding. "I saw what that man did," Silas stated, his voice flat and direct. "It was a dishonorable thing." She could only nod, trying to stifle her sobs. He cleared his throat, the next words feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. "I own a ranch, Blackwood Stades. It's my wife passed a year ago. The house is not well kept. The books are a mess." He looked out toward the distant, hazy mountains, not at her. "I can't offer you what that man promised, but I can offer you honest work. A roof over your head, food on the table, and a fair wage. A position as housekeeper." Elara stared at him, her tears momentarily forgotten. It wasn't a proposal of marriage or romance. It was a lifeline. A practical, desperate offer from a man who looked as lost as she felt. It was a chance to reclaim a sliver of the dignity that had just been stolen from her. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and stood up, her spine straightening. I accept," she said, her voice still trembling but laced with a new, steely thread of resolve. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." "Silas," he corrected quietly. He picked up her suitcase as if it weighed nothing. "The wagon is this way." As she followed him, she didn't look back at the train station or the mercantile. She looked forward, at the broad, steady back of the grieving rancher who had offered not his heart, but something far more valuable, in that moment, a chance. The journey to Blackwood Steads was a silent one, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the horses. Elara sat stiffly on the buckboard, stealing glances at the man beside her. Silas Blackwood's profile was like the rugged landscape they traveled through, stark, weathered, and unrateable. He seemed to exist inside a fortress of grief, and Elara, a stranger indebted to his charity, knew better than to try and breach its walls. When they arrived, she understood the truth of his words. The ranch itself was vast and beautiful, nestled in a valley carved by a winding creek, but the homestead at its heart was a place frozen in time. A layer of dust coated every surface in the two-story house, a fine, gray shroud over memories of a happier life. Dishes were piled in the dry sink. In the main living area, a stack of what looked like business ledgers and loose receipts sat precariously on a side table, threatening to spill onto the floor. It was a home and a business, drowning in sorrow. Silas seemed to see none of it. He deposited her suitcase in a small, sparse room upstairs that would be hers. "The well is out back. Kitchen is yours to manage. I take my meals at sunrise and sunset," he said, his tone clipped and impersonal. Then he retreated, heading for the barn and the familiar, demanding work that was his only solace. In the suffocating silence of the house, Elara found not despair, but a purpose. Her own grief and humiliation were a fresh, sharp wound, but here was a pain so old and deep it had become part of the very structure of the home. She could not fix Silas's heart, but she could fight the dust and disorder. She tied her hair back, found a pail and rags, and set to work. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, and brought order to the chaotic kitchen. With each swipe of the rag, she felt as if she were cleaning away a small piece of her own shame. For 2 weeks, they lived as ghosts orbiting one another. She would leave his meals on the table. He would eat them in silence and leave the plate in the sink. The house began to breathe again under her care, but the man within it remained distant. The true chaos, she learned, was not the dust, but the pile of papers on the side table. It was the heart of the ranch's problems. One evening, after Silas had retreated to the barn after a silent supper, Elara found herself drawn to the stack. She knew it was an overstep, but her father, for all his failings as a shopkeeper, had taught her one thing: the unforgiving logic of numbers. A business lived or died in its ledgers. She carefully lifted the top ledger and opened it. The entries were haphazard, some in a neat, feminine script, Lydia's, she presumed, and the more recent ones in Silas's rough, blocky hand, often ending in frustrated, smudged ink. Receipts were tucked between pages, bills were unpaid, and there was no sense of income versus expense. It was a portrait of a business running on momentum and memory alone. She lit another lamp and, taking a blank sheet of paper, began to work. She started to sort, to categorize, to add and subtract. The complex puzzle of it absorbed her, quieting the anxious thoughts that still plagued her in the dark of night. She was so engrossed, she didn't hear him enter the house. "What are you doing?" His voice, low and suspicious, made her jump. Silas stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the space. His face was grim, his eyes fixed on the papers spread across the table. "Forgive me, Silas," she said, her cheeks flushing. "I know it is not my place, but I know something of bookkeeping. My father was a shopkeeper. I thought perhaps I could help." He walked closer, his boots heavy on the clean floorboards. He looked down at her work. She had separated the receipts into neat piles: feed, hardware, household, and had begun a rudimentary balance sheet. On it, in her clear, precise script, was a column of figures that was alarmingly, undeniably red. He stared at the page, at the stark reality of his financial state laid bare. He saw a year of unfocused spending, of paying whatever price was asked, because he lacked the will to bargain or the focus to check. He saw the slow bleeding of the ranch his father had built, that he and Lydia had dreamed of passing to their own children. He should have been angry at her intrusion. He should have felt the shame of his failure. But what he felt, looking at her determined face illuminated by the lamplight, was a sliver of something else: relief. The chaos had been given a name. The burden he had carried alone now had a second pair of eyes on it. What Silas didn't realize was that, in hiring the abandoned woman from the train station, he hadn't just hired a housekeeper. He had hired an archivist of his life, a woman whose hidden talent for order was the one thing that could begin to pull him back from the brink. He sank into the chair opposite her, the first time he had ever willingly sat at the table with her. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and nodded slowly. "Show me," he said, his voice quiet. "Show me where we stand." The kitchen table became their new headquarters. Each evening, after the grueling work of the ranch was done, Silas would sit with Elara as she meticulously untangled the snarled finances of Blackwood Stades. For the first time since Lydia's death, he was forced to confront the business of living, not just the act of surviving. Elara's presence was a quiet, steadying force. She didn't offer condolences or pry into his grief. She offered facts and figures, a language of logic that cut through the fog of his sorrow. Her greatest discovery came a week into their work. She laid out a series of receipts from Croft's Mercantile, her finger tracing the column of prices. "Silas, look at this," she said, her tone serious. "The price he's charging you for grain is nearly double the price listed in this catalog from Billings. And the cost of this hardware, it's a full third more than you were paying a year ago. When before?" Silas studied the papers, his brow furrowed. He had been paying Croft's bills without question, too numb to notice the slow, parasitic bleed. He saw it now, in Elara's neat columns. Jedidiah Croft hadn't just humiliated Elara. He had been systematically cheating a grieving man for months. A cold anger began to smolder beneath his sorrow. "I knew I wasn't paying attention," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "He took advantage." "We can stop it," Elara said simply. "I've written to the supplier in Billings. We can afford to buy in bulk, and even with the freight costs, we would save a significant amount. We can sever our account with Mr. Croft entirely." It was a bold move. Croft's Mercantile was the only major supplier in Harmony Creek. Cutting ties with him meant making a powerful enemy. But looking at Elara, at her fierce intelligence and unwavering belief that things could be set right, Silas felt a surge of forgotten strength. "Do it," he said. The change was almost immediate. With a proper budget and a reliable, honest supplier, the financial bleeding slowed to a trickle. A fragile trust began to blossom between them in the shared intimacy of their evening work. Silas found himself talking, not just about the ranch, but about his father's dreams for it, about Lydia's favorite spot by the creek. He started to see Elara not as a housekeeper, but as a partner in the truest sense of the word. He noticed the way the lamplight caught the gold in her brown hair, the quick, intelligent spark in her eyes when she solved a problem. The fortress around his heart began to show cracks. But behind the scenes, a different plan was unfolding. Jedidiah Croft was furious. The loss of the Blackwood account was a significant blow to his profits and an even greater one to his ego. That the woman he had cast off as a waif was the architect of his financial loss was a galling insult. His public standing was built on the perception of power, and he could not allow this slight to go unanswered. He began his campaign subtly. A word here, a comment there. In the saloon, he'd buy a round of drinks and casually mention that Silas Blackwood seemed to be struggling, that it was a shame to see a good ranch go to seed. He'd express concern to the church ladies about the propriety of an unmarried woman living out at the Blackwood place, insinuating a moral failing on both their parts. He was a master of insinuation, planting seeds of doubt and disapproval throughout Harmony Creek. The whispers reached Silas and Elara in the form of cold shoulders in town and averted eyes from old family friends. Elara felt the sting of it keenly, painful echo of her humiliation at the train station. "They think I'm a fallen woman, and that you are compromised," she told Silas one evening, her voice tight with hurt. Silas's hands curled into fists. "Let them talk," he said, his voice harder than she'd ever heard it. They are fools listening to a bigger fool. We know the truth of it. But Croft's sabotage was more than just rumor. He began undercutting Silas at the cattle market, colluding with other buyers to drive down the prices for Blackwood stock. Silas, his finances already strained, was forced to sell for less than his cattle were worth. The ranch, which had just begun to stabilize, was once again on precarious ground. Croft was trying to orchestrate a failure, to prove that Silas could not survive without him, and that Elara's presence was a curse, not a blessing. What Croft didn't realize was that his campaign was having the opposite effect on the two people living at Blackwood Stades. The external pressure was forging their fragile alliance into something strong and resilient. They were no longer just an employer and his housekeeper. They were partners, standing together against a common enemy. And Elara, driven by a fierce need to protect the man who had shown her kindness and the home she had helped to rebuild, was about to dig deeper into Croft's dealings than anyone ever had before. The pressure from Jedidiah Croft's campaign was mounting. Every trip to town was a fresh ordeal of whispers and hostile stares. The financial strain was becoming acute, forcing Silas to consider selling off a portion of his herd at a loss just to make it through the season. Desperation was a bitter taste in his mouth, but this time, he wasn't facing it alone. "There's something we're missing," Elara insisted one night, her brow furrowed in concentration over the old ledgers. They were spread across the kitchen table, a familiar battlefield. "His resentment of us seems personal. It's more than just losing your account. It feels like he's trying to bury you. He's an arrogant man, Elara?" "I'm an easy target," Silas said, wariness heavy in his voice. "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's tied to the ranch itself. He wants you to fail." Driven by this conviction, Elara decided to conduct a full audit of the Blackwood Stead's accounts, going back not just 1 year, but 3. She wasn't just looking for overcharges now. She was looking for a motive. She spent days poring over Lydia's neat entries and Silas's later, grief-stricken scrawls. She cross-referenced every transaction with the county registrar's records, which she had painstakingly copied on her last trip to town. It was in a dusty, forgotten box of papers from the year of Lydia's death that she found it. Tucked inside a sheaf of condolence letters was a folded document that did not belong. It was a bill of sale. Her heart began to pound as she unfolded the brittle paper. It recorded the sale of a 20-acre parcel of Blackwood land to one Jedidiah Croft. The price was a pittance, an insultingly low sum for what she knew was a critical piece of property. Then she saw the parcel description, and a chill went down her spine. It was the section of land known as the South Pasture, the piece that contained the main access to Harmony Creek, the ranch's lifeblood, especially during the dry season. Then she saw the signature at the bottom. It wasn't Silas's. It was a clumsy, shaky forgery of his late wife's name, Lydia Blackwood. The date on the document was the most damning part. It was dated 5 days after Lydia had been laid to rest. Elara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She remembered Silas telling her about that week. He'd been in a stupor of grief, barely able to leave his bed, his world shattered. He wouldn't have noticed a document, let alone a land sale. Croft hadn't just preyed on a grieving man's neglect by overcharging him. He had committed active, predatory fraud, stealing the very water from his land while he was at his lowest, most vulnerable point. He had used Lydia's name, desecrating her memory to further his own greed. This was the reason for his viciousness. His entire campaign of sabotage was designed to drive Silas into ruin, to force him to sell the rest of the ranch, so that Croft's fraudulent claim to the creek would never be discovered. That evening, when Silas came in from the fields, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion and worry, she was waiting for him. She didn't speak. She simply slid the forged document across the table. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the page. He saw the land description, the paltry sum. Then he saw the signature. All the air went out of him. The wariness in his face was replaced by a look of profound shock, which slowly hardened into something Elara had never seen before. The deep, quiet sorrow in his eyes finally burned away, replaced by the cold, clear fire of righteous anger. He looked up at Elara, his blue eyes locking with hers. The last wall around his heart didn't just crack, it was obliterated. In that moment, he saw her not just as his ally, but as his savior. She had uncovered a truth he never would have found, defended a memory he thought he was protecting alone. "He didn't just steal from me," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "He used her. He used my grief against me." The why was finally clear. Jedidiah Croft was not just a bully or a cheat. He was a criminal, and now they had the proof. Their fight was no longer just for financial survival or social acceptance. It was a fight for justice. The day of the monthly market was the heartbeat of Harmony Creek. Families from surrounding homesteads and ranches flooded the town square, a bustling nexus of commerce and gossip. It was the perfect stage. Silas and Elara arrived not in their usual work wagon, but with Silas astride his best horse, looking every inch the formidable rancher he was, and Elara beside him, her expression calm and resolute. They were not there to shop, they were there for a reckoning. They found Jedidiah Croft holding court near his mercantile, preening in the sunlight as he glad-handed other ranchers. He saw them approach, and a smug, condescending smile touched his lips, assuming they had come to beg for their line of credit to be restored. "Blackwood," he said loudly, ensuring an audience. "Finally come to your senses, have you? I might be persuaded to reconsider your account for a price." Silas dismounted, his movements deliberate and calm. He walked until he was standing directly in front of Croft. The noisy square seemed to quiet as people sensed the brewing confrontation. "I'm not here for credit, Croft," Silas said, his voice carrying with cold clarity. "I'm here to discuss a piece of land. My land." He pulled the forged document from his coat pocket and held it up. "This bill of sale. For my south pasture. The one with my dead wife's signature on it, dated 5 days after her funeral." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Croft's florid face went pale. "That's a legitimate document? A deal I made with your wife before her untimely passing." "Ole." Silas's voice boomed, turning to the town sheriff, who was now pushing his way through the crowd. "And I have the proof," Croft scoffed, attempting to regain control. "Proof? You have nothing. It's the word of a failing rancher and his housekeeper." He spat the last word like an insult. That was when Elara stepped forward. All eyes turned to her, the quiet, abandoned woman from the train station. She held a leather-bound ledger in her hands. With a confidence that stunned the onlookers, she spoke, her voice not loud, but clear and unshakable. "Mr. Croft is not just a liar, Sheriff. "He is a thief," she began. She opened the ledger. "For the past year, Mr. Croft has systematically overcharged the Blackwood Ranch. On August 10th, he charged 80 cents a bushel for grain you could buy in Billings for 45. On September 3rd, he billed for 3 kegs of nails when only 2 were delivered. I have documented every single fraudulent transaction, every doctored invoice, every penny he has stolen from a man he knew was too deep in grief to notice." She laid it all out. A meticulous, undeniable web of deceit. Her bookkeeping, the skill no one had recognized, became a weapon of absolute truth. She wasn't just making accusations, she was presenting a case, her clear logic and irrefutable evidence stripping away Croft's bluster and lies layer by layer. The crowd murmured, their allegiance shifting with every fact she presented. They were ranchers and homesteaders. They understood numbers, and they understood thieves. Cornered and exposed, Croft began to stammer, his arrogance dissolving into panicked sweat. The sheriff took the forged document from Silas, his face grim. "Jedidiah Croft, you're under arrest for fraud and forgery." As the sheriff led the disgraced merchant away, a profound silence fell over the square, followed by a murmur of approval. The town had seen the truth. Silas's name was cleared, his honor restored. He turned to Elara, who stood tall amidst the crowd, the ledger held to her chest like a shield. He saw everything in that moment: her strength, her integrity, her fierce loyalty. He saw the woman who had brought order to his chaotic house, and his broken heart. The practical arrangement, the lifeline he had offered, had blossomed into something more profound than he had ever thought he could feel again. In front of the entire town, Silas took the ledger from her hands, setting it aside. He gently took her hands in his own. "Elara Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my home. You saved my honor. You saved me. The offer I made you at the train station was for a housekeeper." He looked deep into her eyes. "I am now asking if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife, in truth and in heart. My partner in everything." Tears welled in Elara's eyes, but this time they were tears of overwhelming joy. "Yes, Silas," she whispered. "Yes." The Blackwood steads thrived. Under their shared guidance, it became one of the most prosperous ranches in the valley. Elara was no longer the abandoned bride or the quiet housekeeper, but the respected matriarch of the ranch, her sharp mind as legendary as Silas's skill with cattle. And Silas's heart, once a cold and barren place, was healed, filled with a new, stronger love for the woman who had arrived with nothing and given him everything. And so, Elara's journey from a weeping, abandoned woman at a train station to a beloved and respected partner serves as a powerful reminder that true worth is often hidden and integrity prevails against the greatest injustices. If this story of resilience and the fight for justice stirred something in you, please share your thoughts in the comments below, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring narratives about people who turned adversity into triumph. What was the most impactful moment for you?